One of the fastest growing segments of cycling today is gravel grinding or gravel grinder events. In fact, it's so popular that my buddy who heads up gravelcyclist.com has over 100 events for 2016 across the United States on his calendar that he puts on his website. Now this is what's typically known as dirt road riding, B road riding, gravel roads, whatever you want to call them, but it's off the beaten path of the typical road that a road bike would be used for. Now people use different kind of bikes for these. Some people use road bikes, maybe put a little bit bigger tires on them. Some people use mountain bikes. But the bikes that combine efficiency and comfort and speed the best for these type of events is going to be cyclocross bikes, or more specifically gravel grinder bikes. And although the differences are subtle between a cyclocross bike and a gravel grinder bike, there are differences. As one who owns one of each, I'm going to attempt to explain those differences and help you decide which bike would be right for you. If you are familiar with mountain biking and the types of bikes, the best comparison that I can come up with between gravel grinder bikes and cyclocross bikes is going to be trail versus cross-country bikes. Now I've found that the differences between a trail and cross-country bike are more noticeable than a cyclocross bike versus gravel grinder bikes. But let me show you the bikes and we'll get into the differences. The two bikes that I'll be using for this comparison are the Giant TCX Pure Cyclocross race bike and the Niner RLT9. The RLT9 is Niner's gravel grinder bike. They also make the BSB9 RDO, which is their pure cyclocross race bike. I've owned the BSB9 and it's a phenomenal bike, as is the RLT9. So these are the bikes that I'll be using. Let's first start by talking about the geometries of the two bikes, because that is one thing that really makes a difference between the two. Head angle. First of all, the Niner has a 71 degree head angle, and the cyclocross race bike, the Giant, has a 71.5 degree head angle, so it's a little bit steeper, and I'll talk about what that does here in a few minutes. The seat tube angle, the Giant is a 73, the Niner is a little bit more upright at 73.5. Now I know those differences don't sound like much, but they do play into how the bike rides. The other thing is the wheelbase. The wheelbase is going to be longer on a gravel grinder bike to make it more stable. Again, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So this wheelbase on the Niner RLT9 is 102.5 centimeters, and on the Giant it's 101.9, and incidentally the BSB9 RDO is even shorter at 101 centimeters for the wheelbase. The chainstays are also going to be longer on a gravel grinder bike and shorter on a cyclocross bike. This is your chainstay. The shorter a chainstay, the more agile the bike's going to be, the more quickly you can change directions. And so the Giant has a chainstay length of 43 centimeters, whereas the Niner RLT is a little bit longer at 43.5, and again on the BSB9 RDO it's 42.5. So the BSB9 is even a little bit more aggressive than the Giant cyclocross race bike. The thing that makes the biggest difference in geometry, in my opinion, is the bottom bracket height. Now there are two ways of measuring bottom bracket height. One is just going from the ground up and measuring how high the bottom bracket is from the ground, and then another way of measuring it is bottom bracket drop. And bottom bracket drop you would measure by going from an axle to the axle, drawing a straight line, and then seeing how far below that line the bottom bracket would be. Now if I were to measure this, and this is not scientific at all, I'm not, in fact I'm on grass, so it's good, but I'm gonna get just a real general measurement to see the differences in the bottom bracket. Again, this is not an actual bottom bracket height because I'm just going to the bottom of the crank arm. So that's 28 centimeters on the Giant from the ground. This one's lower, so this one would be about 26. So the bottom bracket is actually 2 centimeters lower on the gravel grinder bike. So now let's talk about why you would want a bottom bracket higher or lower. A bottom bracket that's lower is going to give you a feeling of sitting more inside the bike, and it's going to make the bike more stable, so it lowers your center of gravity. As far as cornering, it helps you to carve the turns as opposed to just jumping from one turn to the other. So the higher your center of gravity, the higher the bottom bracket, is going to make the bike feel a little bit more twitchy. It's going to make a bike that's a little bit more agile. But what I've noticed today is that more cyclocross bikes are coming with lower bottom brackets. Back in the day, way back in the day, when they used to use toe clips, the big clips on top of the pedals, you started your ride or race with your foot out of it and the clips would hit the ground. So that's one reason they put bottom brackets higher. But another advantage to a higher bottom bracket is the fact that you're going to have better pedal clearance. So when you're in a cyclocross race, you are going from turn to turn and taking some sharp turns, and you don't want to strike your pedal on the ground or on an obstacle. And on a gravel grinder bike, you're not doing that kind of turning. You're more doing long rides on dirt roads, so you're not worried about how quick you can get through a set of turns. What you want is a bike that's more stable and more comfortable over the long haul. So that's why you're going to see lower bottom brackets on a gravel grinder bike and a little bit higher bottom brackets on a cyclocross race bike. And I'll just add one more thing about bottom bracket height, is that it's really a subjective issue. Some people may want a lower bottom bracket on a cyclocross race bike, because one advantage to that is it makes remounting the bike a little bit higher, or a little bit easier, because the seat's not as high. So the higher the bottom bracket, the higher you got to jack up your seat. So remounting on a cyclocross race bike may be easier with a lower bottom bracket. So that's one thing that when you're looking to buy a bike, you may want to try to test ride different ones to see how different bottom bracket heights may affect the handling of the bike, and even remounting on the bike. So again, it's subjective. If you ride your cyclocross bike on trails, which I do sometimes for bike handling practice, a higher bottom bracket is going to allow you to clear obstacles like little logs or roots or rocks a little bit easier. So again, just kind of think about what type of riding you're going to do and determine what type of bottom bracket height would be best for you. One final thing that I'll mention about geometry before we get into the ride qualities of the bikes is the head tube sometimes is going to be taller on a gravel grinder bike as opposed to a cyclocross race bike. And what I mean is basically the distance from the crown of the fork up to where your first spacer or cap would be. So this is typically shorter on a cyclocross bike and taller on a gravel grinder bike. And the reason is, on a gravel grinder, you want to be a little bit more upright. You don't need your weight bent over as far as you would on a cyclocross bike. Now these bikes actually have very similar head tube lengths, so there's not much of a difference. So you could adjust the height of the handlebars with your spacers also, but again, you're probably going to find a little bit taller head tube on a gravel grinder bike. Now that we've talked about geometries, let's talk about what the bikes are intended to do. And I mentioned it a little bit, but as far as cornering, a cyclocross bike needs to jump from corner to corner. It also needs to accelerate quickly. So whether it's a start or just coming out of a turn and getting back up to speed. The reason that you have a little bit shorter chainstay and shorter wheelbase and steeper head angle is so that you can accelerate and sprint quickly. And again, for cornering on a gravel grinder bike, like I mentioned before, you're not worried about getting through a quick set of corners. It's more about carving a corner at speed. And while I'm talking about speed, the fastest you would probably ever go in a cyclocross race is going to be probably 25 miles an hour. And you're not doing long climbs, and we'll talk about gearing in a few minutes. But so cyclocross bikes, the speed band is probably a little bit more narrow than a gravel grinder. On a gravel grinder event, a lot of those are held in the mountains. You might be climbing for an hour and need a really low gear and a comfortable kind of climbing position, and then you may descend at high speeds. So if you're descending at a high speed, that longer wheelbase, that longer chainstay is going to make the bike more stable. You're probably going to hit higher speeds on a gravel grinder ride or race. You could go 35, 40 miles an hour on a downhill. And when you're going that fast, you do not want a bike that's very twitchy, with the steeper geometries that would be on a cyclocross bike. Also, cyclocross bikes don't necessarily need to be all that comfortable because of the distance and duration of the event. So a cyclocross race is an hour or less, whereas a gravel grinder event could be, 5, 6, 7 hours. So comfort is a lot more important on a gravel grinder bike, and that's why all those little subtle geometry difference come into play to help you be more comfortable. The trade-off to a bike that's more stable on high speeds means that the bike is going to be a little bit harder to steer at slower speeds. And I've really noticed this when I jump on my cyclocross bike, just how easy the thing steers, especially if you're just going around some really slow, tight corners, which you often have in cyclocross races. The course designers will set up some really kind of technical type turns where you are really cornering hard at a slow speed, and sometimes you do that 2 or 3 times within about 10 to 15 seconds. So a gravel grinder bike is going to be a little bit harder to steer around the slow turns. In fact, there was one time where I was turning around on a dirt road when I had first gotten my gravel grinder bike, and I almost washed the tire out because it just didn't corner as quickly as I had intended it to do, because I was used to the cyclocross race bike. So again, you do notice a difference. Even though those geometry numbers don't really sound like much of a difference, I do notice when I jump back on my cyclocross race bike just how agile the bike feels. And I just want to add that the faster you go on a dirt road, the more advantage that a gravel grinder bike would have over a cyclocross bike. And at the end of this video, I'm going to give some buying tips, but I'll just throw that in right now. Think about how fast you're going to be riding the bike. If you're going to be descending mountain dirt roads at a high rate of speed, then you probably want to look more at a gravel grinder type bike. If you're wanting to ride dirt roads, but your roads are pretty flat and you're not going to be hitting those really high speeds, you could easily get away with a cyclocross bike. And again, I'll mention that at the end of this video. So whereas gravel grinder bikes are better at higher speeds, they're also better over a longer ride. So the longer your ride is going to be on dirt roads, the more advantage that a gravel grinder bike is going to have. If you're not going to be doing extremely long rides, again, you could easily get away with a cyclocross race bike. So comfort over the long haul is something that's really important on a gravel grinder bike. Like I said, you're sitting more upright, the bike's more stable, and a bike that's more stable is going to require you to have less effort in keeping the bike in a straight line. It's going to allow you to relax a little bit more, especially at high speed. And as you do that over a long event, that advantage is going to be bigger and bigger the longer your event, because fighting a bike over 3, 4, 5 hour ride on dirt roads is going to be pretty fatiguing if you're having to just work the bike and keep it on a straight line. So again, the longer the ride, the more advantage that a gravel grinder bike is going to have. Another advantage that you're going to find on a gravel grinder bike are going to be braze-ons or holes to put on racks and fenders. So you can see here, you've got this little hole for, you could again do a rack or put on a set of fenders. And you've also got the ability here to mount a fender. So fenders that actually bolt onto the bike, you're going to need these little screws and holes to do that. If I jump over here to my cyclocross race bike, you've got nothing to do that. There is no bridge between the seat stays. There are no bolts or braze-ons or anything to put on a rack. Now, this is the top level carbon giant race bike. The model below this actually does, I believe, have some braze-ons or holes for racks or fenders. Same thing with the fork. You can see here on this gravel grinder, you've got these holes to mount a rack on the front as well. So that's one thing that's probably going to be a deal breaker for you on a cyclocross bike if you're wanting to commute with racks or do really long overnight type rides where you're carrying panniers, or you want to put fenders mounted on the bike. So like I said, some cyclocross bikes actually do come with that. So that's one thing you're going to want to look at when you're going to buy a bike, is think ahead and decide, if you're ever going to come into a situation where you want to mount racks and fenders. Gearing is something that's going to be really important in the bike that you choose. Most gravel grinder bikes are going to come with 2 chain rings in the front. Now I have seen some with 1, but I think most of them you're going to see 2. So let's look at the gearing on the gravel grinder. You've got a 46 large chain ring and a 36 small. In the back it goes up to a 32 tooth cog, so the bigger the cog, the easier the gear. On the cyclocross race bike, we've got 1 chain ring that's a 40, so it's right in between the 36, 46 that's on the gravel grinder, or very close to being in between, and it's got a 25 largest cog in the back. So the gearing, like I said in the beginning of the video, the gearing range that you need on a cyclocross bike, the speed band, is going to be more narrow, so you don't need as big of a gear difference. So like I said, probably the slowest you're going to go in a cyclocross race is 5-6 miles an hour. Now I've done races where I've had some really short, steep grinds that have been tough to get up, and I have needed a little bit easier gear, but the climb was really short, so it didn't matter a whole lot. Whereas a gravel grinder, you might be going up a steep mountain road at 3 miles an hour for 30 minutes. So having that easier gear in the back, bigger cog in the back, smaller chain ring in the front, is going to make a difference. So my buying advice would be that if you're going to only have 1 bike, I would get 2 chain rings in the front. So if you're buying a cyclocross race bike, but you think you're going to be using it for dirt road riding in more hilly areas, I would recommend going ahead and getting a cyclocross bike, race bike, that has 2 chain rings in the front. Now I mentioned the 9er BSB9 RDO. Those actually do come with 2 chain rings in the front. So that bike is going to be a little bit more versatile than this cyclocross race bike. Now, since I have 2 bikes, I like having 1 chain ring in the front. It makes it simpler in cyclocross races. It's got a narrow ride chain ring and it's got a chain keeper, so the chain is really stable. Dropping a chain in a cyclocross race could be disastrous. It could be the difference between winning and getting 5th place. So, I like having this 1 chain ring setup. In a gravel grinder event, if you drop a chain, you just pull over and you may lose a minute, but it's not a big deal because the event's so long. So that's just kind of a tip there for the single chain ring. So again, gearing is something you really need to pay attention to when buying a cyclocross bike or a gravel grinder bike. Another difference that you're going to find on some cyclocross and gravel grinder bikes is tire clearance. So this tire is a pretty wide 35C tire. The 9er RLT9 can fit up to about a 44C tire, about a 1.75 inch wide tire. And you're going to typically run a wider, bigger tire on a gravel grinder bike, whereas a cyclocross race bike is going to have a little bit narrower tires. In fact, the UCI limit, I think, is a 32C tire for professional races. So that's a more narrow tire. On the gravel grinder, you've got more varied terrain. You might be going over rocks and roots. You might even do a little bit of trails. So having a bigger tire is going to give you more cushion, and it's going to make the bike more stable and give you more grip over some really gnarly, mountain type descents and climbs. So tire clearance. Now, this particular Giant actually has extremely good tire clearance. You can see that, and you have to have decent tire clearance on a cyclocross race bike because of the mud. You don't want mud packing up around your tire. So you're going to have pretty good tire clearance. The same with the front. There are some cyclocross race bikes that I've seen that you could probably go up to maybe a 38C tire, and that's about it. Again, the Giant is a little bit wider than some of the other ones I've seen. Same with the front. You've got plenty of tire clearance on a gravel grinder bike for running these larger tires. So again, that's something you're going to want to pay attention to if you're getting a bike that you're wanting to do both cyclocross racing and gravel grinding. Make sure you got enough tire clearance so that when cyclocross season is over, you can throw on some bigger tires and use it for dirt road riding. While I am mentioning tires, let me just say that on gravel grinder tires, a lot of times you don't need really big knobs. You want something that's got really low rolling resistance, because you don't need a knobby tire on a dirt road unless your event does do, you know, it's a really muddy event that's on some gnarly terrain. Some of the gravel grinder events I've seen, you know, it's more like a trail than a road. So it's going to depend on your condition, but generally you don't need the big thick knobs that you would have on a cyclocross bike. Now, thick is relative because compared to a mountain bike, these are not thick at all. But this is a more mud type tire. This is the stock tire that came on the Giant, and you can see that it's got some really good cornering knobs. So you're cornering really hard in a cyclocross race, whereas a gravel grinder, you know, you may hit some corners at a high speed, but they're a little bit more controlled than what you would find on a cyclocross race. So again, the actual tire knobs is something that you're going to want to look at when you buy a bike. Now, what's nice about having one bike, or what I would recommend in having one bike, is having maybe another set of tires or even another set of wheels, so that if you're, you know, doing gravel road type riding, you can put on tires that have lower rolling resistance, and then put on your knobbies for a cyclocross race. Brakes are another thing that you need to look at when buying a bike. Most gravel grinder bikes are going to come with disc brakes. Disc brakes give much better modulation and power, and they don't collect mud like a typical cantilever brake that you saw on older cyclocross bikes. Now, most new cyclocross bikes today are coming also with disc brakes, and that's because the UCI is now allowing disc brakes in professional races, so it's really kind of changed the game. Having used both, I would recommend disc brakes 100% of the time over the cantilever type brakes that use the rim as a braking surface. You just get much better power. The feel is so much better. Now, this bike has a 140 millimeter rotor, so a little bit smaller rotor, which gives you a little bit lower weight, a little bit lower rotational weight, but a little bit less power. So on a gravel grinder bike, where again you're hitting higher speeds, I would recommend at least a 160 rotor. I wouldn't go more than 180, but I think 160 is going to be plenty for both the front and the back. So this bike has 160 on the front and back, whereas the cyclocross race bike has 140. So that's something you need to look at when buying a bike. For me, the biggest advantage of having two bikes is that I can have the cyclocross bike set up totally for races, especially during cross season. I don't want to have to be changing wheels or taking off a seat pack and a mirror and a water bottle cage when I want to go out on Monday or Tuesday and do a gravel road ride. So having each bike set up, now I don't have my seat pack and mirror or anything on this bike right now, but I would typically have a mirror, I'd have a seat pack on here, I'd have two water bottle cages, so completely set up for doing longer gravel roads. But I realize that not everybody is going to be able to have two bikes. So let me give you some buying advice when looking for a bike. Now, I've already mentioned a few tips, you know, as far as brakes and things like that. But let me go over a few more things to help you decide which bike would be right for you. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that the differences between a cross-country mountain bike and a trail mountain bike are more noticeable than a gravel grinder and cyclocross bike. And let me kind of explain that with an example. And that is, if I were to race my trail bike in a cross-country race, I wouldn't probably do very good. It makes that big of a difference. However, I would not hesitate racing a gravel grinder bike in a cyclocross race, and neither would I hesitate racing my cyclocross race bike or riding my cyclocross race bike on a long, you know, dirt road race or ride. So the two can be fairly interchangeable. So the difference is, again, even though they're not huge like you would find more in the difference between a long travel mountain bike and a cross-country bike. So with that, if cyclocross racing is your main focus, then obviously I think you need to get a cyclocross race bike. Even if you're going to be riding it on gravel roads, I think you're going to enjoy a pure cyclocross race bike. Even though I said you can race a gravel grinder bike in a cyclocross race, I think you're going to enjoy a cyclocross race bike more. Now, even if you're wanting to do both cyclocross racing and gravel road type riding, I still think a cyclocross race bike is probably going to be the best choice. Now, if you do that, if you're going to get one bike, use the advice that I gave earlier. Get a bike with 2 chain rings in the front. Look at your brakes. Maybe even get a bike with 160 rotors. You know, there are differences in geometries in cyclocross bikes, so some may be a little bit more aggressive. If you're really wanting to get into gravel road riding and still cyclocross race, look for a cyclocross bike that doesn't have real aggressive geometries. Now, if you ride dirt roads but you still enjoy a bike that's really snappy, can sprint, cyclocross race bike is probably what you're going to want to get. There are some gravel grinder type events that to me are more like road racing on dirt. In other words, there are attacks, you're having to accelerate quickly, people are riding real aggressively. In those type situations, I think a cyclocross race bike is still going to be the best choice. Again, look at your gearing and stuff like that, and tires, depending on the type of terrain that you're going to be riding. Now, if you're not going to be doing cyclocross races and you don't need a bike that's super agile, then I think the gravel grinder bike is going to be your best choice. It's especially if you're going to be doing commuting, you know, just a wide variety of riding on the bike, then the gravel grinders make really good bikes, especially, like I said before, if you're going to need to put racks and fenders on the bike. Those braze-ons are going to be what you're going to want to look for that application. Now, obviously, not everyone who buys a gravel grinder bike is going to be doing official gravel grinder events. You may just want to get out on long dirt road rides, and you know, overall speed, it really doesn't matter. And these type of bikes, the gravel grinder bikes, make a really good choice for riding dirt roads, even, you know, if your rides include road. I'm going to, if I ever do you know, trips up to the mountains where you know, I go up with buddies and do roads, I would bring this gravel grinder bike and I would just put on some smaller tires. So the gravel grinder bikes are extremely versatile. They can do cross races, they can do gravel grinder events, they can do just long Sunday afternoon dirt road rides, they can do commutes, they can be road bikes with road tires. So if you want a bike that's that versatile, look at a gravel grinder. So that's going to wrap it up on cyclocross versus gravel grinder bikes. Hopefully the information that I shared with you in this video is going to help you decide which bike is right for you. Thanks for watching.